There is a lot going on in the world today. Today is the Wednesday of the show when we've now been in lockdown for a lot of businesses have now been shut down or significantly impacted. People have been quarantined. Elderly people are kind of in the most risky group with this coronavirus or COVID-19, Wuhan flu. Some tweets have even called it the Chinese virus. Who knows what we call it?
Some tweets, including those of the actual commander-in-chief, I should just note for the record, in case people don't realize that. That's what he's calling it.
I thought I would just slide that in without any challenge, but there's no such luck.
I can't believe he's calling it that. Like, politics aside... And I will say, and this is going to be kind of a freewheeling show, so we might as well just get into this, that I've been reluctantly impressed with how he's been handling things. I am like kind of surprised at the just the all hands on deck sort of response and the reasonableness with which it's being addressed at the top. So I will just set that out there, and most people who listen to the show can already know or could certainly infer that I didn't vote for him, but I have been impressed. So there we go.
All right.
Well. So speaking of the pandemic and the coronavirus, give us a Doug download and a Dr. Hawk, perspective on this.
Oh, we'll let the primary mansplainer riff on this. So I've heard a preview of some of his findings, and he has a lot to say. So just everybody sit back for about 45 minutes because you're about to get schooled.
Well, I don't know. Obviously, I have several comments to make about the whole wide-ranging process, and then I have more narrowly focused on our own personal best interests and what we think the future will hold. But the first thing that I would say is that that based on the original alarm coming from the data in China, I think that essentially the right moves have been made. In my judgment, in other words, the right move is to overreact when you don't know what's coming. So this has actually been remarkable. It's been a worldwide phenomenon, and I'm super impressed by actually the heads of state all over the world are not sort of putting their heads in the sand. They're reacting very quickly and really in an unprecedented fashion. So you can thank the modern world with the extraordinary communication capacities that we have now. So what we're seeing is a huge reaction. The only question in retrospect will be, was it enough and was it soon enough? Because you're battling something that is very much out of your control. So so my first comment would be, I'm pretty amazed at how the people around the world in all different places are quickly and peacefully essentially changing their behavior in a radical way as we have the world attuned to a major problem. Now, the second thing that I will say is that the problem that you have here is my favorite word that Jen will crack up whether you see it or not. This is all about parameters.
So many parameters.
She knows that I like nothing better than to analyze parameters. In fact, there really isn't anything better in life other than analyze.
Which I absolutely agree with. I think it's just a question of what parameters you're analyzing. Some parameters are inherently much more satisfying and interesting than others, and Dr. Lisle and I do not always agree on what parameters those are at any given time.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so back to parameters.
Here I'm just wondering what the definition of a parameter is.
These are very interesting parameters. Well, he'll be happy to mansplain that to you right now, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, parameter is a variable of a problem. And so what we're trying to figure out is we're actually trying to figure out what is the nature of the problem that we're facing in terms of sheer numbers and human suffering and cost. That's what we want to know. And so obviously, had there been a breakout of a flu in China and they would have had 80,000 people infected, and 57 people had died, this would not be an issue. That you would not have the worldwide response. It wouldn't even be close. It's the fact that they reported about 5% of their people dying. That's what freaked everybody out. So that's a parameter. Had this literally been had it been 500 people or 400 people instead of 4,000 people, you would not be seeing the response that you're seeing today. So this is nothing other than a parametric problem. So that certainly got my attention, and it certainly has everybody's attention. Everybody that's trying to get their hands around this problem and figure out what to do is staring at these parameters. And certainly the world has known about the possibility of some really nasty virus getting loose and going wholesale and wiping out the human race, particularly something that could be artificially manufactured or messed with somehow. So, everybody that's old enough to chew gum and walk has heard about Ebola virus and should be appropriately terrified. But we haven't had anything that was widely communicable that had any big time power, other than pretty much where you see these nasty variants of some kind of a flu come along every once in a while, and the one that visits the United States every year. These things are killing 30, 40,000 people, and that we shrug our shoulders. And the reason why we shrug our shoulders is the vast majority of those people are elderly and sick, and so they're compromised, and we don't know too many of those people because there's only 40,000 of them. And so so it doesn't feel intimidating, and it doesn't feel intimidating if you're an epidemiologist. And it's also the case that those 40,000, probably you would save a good chunk of them if everybody would immunize, which people don't, and it's their own choice to do so. But I don't. But it's not because I'm worried about dying from the flu. It's about whether or not you think you're going to get the flu and suffer. But the issue there is that generally your very most vulnerable people, late in life and somehow significantly compromised, you've got a small percentage of people, very small percentage of people will die as a result of the flu. Now, this looks different because it's not a tiny percentage. This percentage ultimately started out at 5%, which shook the world and grabbed the world's attention. And then you have Italy coming in second, and the numbers look similar. Now, finally, so I've been staring at those numbers, and everybody I've talked to has been saying, "Look, if it's 3 or 4%, we're in for a serious problem, a tremendous problem." In the final analysis, the Chinese data looks like it wound up about 2.4% or something like that, which is still astronomical. However, so I was staring at that as everybody with a brain that's actually working on the problem. But when the South Koreans started testing extensively, their data now looks like it's about 1%. Now, 1% is still huge. So this is nothing like the flu, which is, 0.1%. So it's basically 10 times deadlier than the flu, which is, tremendous, tremendously dangerous. So you're going to wind up with potentially, in principle, 3 million Americans. If everybody was infected in this year, then this would result in probably 3 million deaths. Whether or not they would be additional deaths, in other words, a certain percentage of those people would have been dying this year anyway.
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah, that's a big question. We don't know. My guess is quite a few of the people that would have been dying anyway would be the people where this would kick them over. That's an important consideration when we try to grapple with the magnitude of what this problem really looks like. Now, one thing that we also are seeing in the evidence is that we're seeing a significant difference in males and females as victims. There's a reason for this, and that is that in China and in South Korea, there is a huge difference in the amount of smoking that men do versus women. So in those cultures, they average 25% or so people smoking, but about 50% of men smoke and about 5% of women smoke. this is an extraordinary difference in behavior. And so this is an interesting parameter to investigate, because it's going to turn out that's going to lead us the clues as to why the men are dying at a significantly higher rate than the women. So this is going to tell us that an eyeball estimate is going to give us probably at least a 3-to-1 factor that if you're a smoker, you're probably 3 times as likely to die from this disease. Now, the next thing up is, so there's basically 2 main effects that we're looking at. Are you smoking, and how old are you? So if you're under 60 and you're not smoking, your odds of dying from this disease are effectively 0. They're so close to 0. I mean, we're not even sure what they are. There's not enough data to tell us. But we know that it's really low. At least it looks like so right now. It's going to be on the order of probably similar to the flu. And if you're not terrified about the flu, I wouldn't be terrified about this thing. So the action is really going to start when you're about 50 if you're a smoker. So if you're 50 and a smoker, or you're very unhealthy at that age, now you're going to start to see some evidence. So I think the numbers are going to roughly look about like this. Trust me, nobody knows, but it's probably 1.5% of people in their 50s would die from this if they were infected. However, remember that actually, if it's 1.5%, about that effect size is doubled by the existence of smokers in the pool. So it's actually probably 0.75% for a non-smoker. Now, before we panic over that number, you have to understand that 0.75%, or whatever that is, 1 every 130 people or so, that would die of this thing. That's a scary looking phenomenon, except that those people, that 1 out of 130, is not a random individual out of the population. 1 out of 130 people in their 50s is pretty damn sick, even if they're not a smoker. So if you look down the chart and you look at who that's dying of this thing, you're going to find 64-year-old woman, complications of diabetes. Okay, you're going to find that they're a very sick bunch of people. It's not always going to be true. Just as with the flu, sometimes if someone gets for whatever reasons that we don't know, once in a blue moon, anybody, me, you, Nathan, somebody could take a shot out of left field, but it's very extremely uncommon, and it isn't something that we walk around worried about. However, this flu, or this thing, whatever it is, whatever you want to call it, this thing is going to be significantly tougher. But once again, we're going to find the track marks in the snow are going to be 2 things: age and cigarette smoking, and / general health. In your 60s, it's going to be probably 3%. And again, the base rate is going to be probably 1.5% for non-smokers, and 3 times that, or probably 4.5 or 5% for smokers. So if it's in your 70s, it's going to be 1 notch higher, probably 4 or 5%, and then in your 80s, it's probably going to be 7 or 8%. So just to we're probably going to find that non-smokers in their 80s are probably going to be 4%. And you might say, well, wow, that's a terrifying number. And if I'm at the CDC and I'm looking at that, we've got, I don't know how many people that age that we have, maybe 20 million. And so if we do, and we're looking at 4%, or actually altogether, it might be 8%. So if everybody was infected, that might be 1.6 million, and they would be coming. In other words, the vast majority of the tragedies are going to be taking place people over 75 years old. And so we might look at this and we might say, wow, that's a tidal wave of deaths. That's a tremendous amount of people. 5 or 6% of our elderly people are wiped out in a year. And it would be. And it would be a horrific thing, and it might even happen, just despite our best efforts. However, when we actually look inside the parameters at what it is that we're seeing there, and you start to see what the amount of loss of life is, that the life expectancy of an 80-year-old might be 5 years, maybe 6 years, something in that nature. I haven't checked the charts, but it's in that general range. And so if you have 6 or 7% of those people additionally were 6 or 7% of them die of this virus. We have to remember that 10 or 15% of them were probably going to pass away in this next year anyway. And of those people that were going to pass away, there's going to be an overlap with the 6%. So the question is, how many additional people? And so it's going to be less than the reported deaths that you're going to be seeing, except as we start to count that, hey, this is a tough way to go, and maybe you went 6 months early. Maybe you went a year early. But what we're not going to find is the kind of tragedy that I think is around people's heads. And when you think about 2 or 3 million people dying, it's completely different phenomenon if 1% of Americans die, 3 million people die, and the average age is the average age of the population, i.e. 40 years old. That means 3 million people left 40 years of life on the table. That is an incredible tragedy. It is quite a bit different if 3 million people leave 2 or 3 years of life on the table. It's 5% of the tragedy. Now it's bad. It's believe me, I hope that the geniuses and all the efforts that we go to do everything possible to see to it that doesn't happen. But the level of the anxiety that people have, a great deal of that anxiety is about the notion that we could all be victims and that we could all be taken down, and that this whole thing I heard people talk about I heard politicians talking about how this is akin to World War II. This isn't even remotely similar to World War II. It's not even close in the same order of magnitude. Okay? In World War II, you had people of all ages, catching disaster and dying and leaving their entire lives on the table. This is not what we're seeing. Okay? So this is my way of looking at it. I hope it doesn't sound heartless. I hope it sounds essentially realistic. And I think that what we're going to find in the months to come, incidentally, my estimates here are admittedly not particularly crystal clear, because I'm going on the existing evidence of the time. I think that evidence is starting to look pretty good. So it's starting to look like a very, very dangerous, nasty virus if you are elderly and ill. Okay? Particularly nasty if you're a cigarette smoker. So I don't mean to blame the victim, but the truth of the matter is that the most important thing, public health thing that could happen that would more than mitigate the effects of the losses from this virus would be if you had a 10 or 15% reduction in cigarette smoking. That would more than make up for the effect of this. So right now, 14% of Americans smoked. If that turned to 12% in the next 3 months, that would save more lives than the coronavirus could take. So amazingly, if life is precious, it's actually already bigger than this problem. The solution is actually already in people's hands. Incidentally, that includes people right now that are at risk. If you're in your 50s and you're a cigarette smoker and you're listening to this, which I doubt we have very many of on this podcast, but if that is true, you are at considerably elevated risk. And the biggest thing that you can do is to not wash your hands or worry about exposure, because there's a good chance you're going to get exposed. The biggest thing that you can do is stop the smokes immediately, and in a matter of days and a few weeks, your lungs can recover enough that might be the difference between life and death. Might be the most important move you ever made. Okay? So anyway, I think what's going to happen, and Jen can talk about this, I'm sure, at wider length, but I think that we're going to find that as the truth seeps in on people in the next 90 days, as we start to see that it is not a worldwide phenomenon killing people everywhere, it's actually a targeted phenomenon that is picking on our very weakest, elderly, and sickest people, and that it's taking a little bit of life away from these people. It's not taking life away from an average healthy 60-year-old, and then suddenly he's sacrificing 25 years of his life. That's not happening. It's not, if that happens, it's going to be extraordinarily rare. And so that being the case, I think the truth about this is going to start dawning on people, and they're going to start to push back relative to the sacrifices that they're being asked to make. I think those sacrifices are extremely reasonable in the present while we don't know the parameters. But I think as the parameters emerge, and I think as they look maybe something like I believe they look, I think that pretty soon people are going to say, well, good luck to everybody. And remember, this doesn't mean I'm sacrificing an 83-year-old. The truth is, if you're a non-smoking 83-year-old, there's probably a 97% chance that you would not die after contracting this disease. And if you did die, remember, you are one of the weakest non-smoking individuals that's 83. You're in the bottom 3 percentile. So what did we really think about your life expectancy at that point? If you're a 3rd percentile non-smoking healthy 83-year-old, what does that actually mean for your life expectancy? It isn't the 5 years that's the statistical average. It's not even close. So this is obviously no one wants to see life truncated by any means. However, I think it's going to dawn on this culture and the world that the greatest fear that people have had of a Ebola derivative type of thing, some incredible pandemic crisis that could have the power to do phenomenal damage, that I think we're going to discover, no, that's probably not what this is. And so as a result, I think ultimately the actions will become muted, and essentially we will care and we will spend money and we will make investments and we will do scientific research, and we'll probably come up with hopefully a vaccine so that a lot of future generations of elderly people will be better protected. But ultimately, I think life's going to return to normal. My guess is in 3 to 4 months. That's as this truth dawns. So that's see, it wasn't 45 minutes, Jen.
No, that was very nicely contained. Quarantined even.
Yeah, quarantined.
Well,
you're right. All right.
Well, Dr. Hawk, we still got 20 more minutes, so Dr. Lisle, you can keep.
Yeah. Jen's got her own thoughts on this. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Dr. Hawk, so tell us your take on this.
Yeah, well, I don't think I can add anything to the parameterization. I think that's well established and very well done. And Dr. Lisle's thought a lot more about those hard numbers than I have. I'm a political scientist and a social scientist in general, and I'm most fascinated by the social dynamics of this whole thing and just watching people's cost benefit analyses move around in real time relative to the stability of their personalities. So this is a common theme that we talk about all the time on the podcast, and this is very just inherently satisfying as a social scientist to sort of watch the natural experiment of this unfold on social media and in the communities around us, and it's just fascinating and unprecedented. And I think what Doug's getting at with as people are running better refined cost benefit analyses as we move forward into this. We're in this period of great uncertainty, and people are feeling a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety, and the stories of exceptions to the rule, so that the young, healthy people that have been stricken down, those are going to get more play in social media. They're going to get repeated more. They're going to get elevated to the top of the discussion, and that's part of what is also distorting people's perception of what this is about and how deadly it is. Because this goes back to what we were talking about last week with if it bleeds, it leads. That was always the mantra of my journalist parents when they were chasing some big story. This is what drives headlines, and it also drives eyeballs on social media. So the exceptions to the rule, you're not going to see the stories about the very the person with complications from diabetes who's 67 who's getting taken down by this. You're going to see the story about some 41-year-old with absolutely no symptoms who had a little cough one day, and then it just rapidly escalates and turns into this terrible situation. There's also a lot of uncertainty about we haven't didn't talk explicitly about this whole flatten the curve idea. And the concept that it's not just that people have anxiety about the fatality rate and about being taken out themselves or somebody that they care about being taken out. It's the sort of opportunity cost and the uncertainty and the worry about hospitals being overwhelmed and too many people getting sick at the same time and the shortage of ventilators and all these other things that we've been discussing. And I think people look at that situation and that leads to a little bit of an estimate of their own vulnerability, even if it's not to the virus itself. It's just the general vulnerability that they would have that something bad might happen to them at any time that might send them to the hospital. And now they're competing with this wave of people who are overwhelming the ICU. So that's a lot of what's going on too. So I think as we get into this process and the data starts coming in and we start getting better calibrated as to what it actually looks like, whether people are paying attention to the actual numbers or not, they're going to be running revised CBs as they don't know anybody personally who's been hospitalized. They do know people who were testing positive but who got through it okay. They themselves were tested positive and got through it okay. There's a new story every day about some new celebrity who tests positive. So Tom Hanks, half the NBA seems to have it. Idris Elba, lots of people, lots of well-known people are testing positive. Trudeau's wife. This is just a short list as of today that we're talking about. And so I am, it's amazing to watch every time we hear of a new celebrity who's testing positive, because this seems to be used as fuel for the fire to, oh my God, this is terrifying. We need to lock down even more. And I see this and I'm heartened and encouraged because it's telling me that this thing's everywhere, that it's all over the place. People are testing positive everywhere, and that basically dilutes the fatality number. It's not like we are unaware of people who are getting taken out by this. We're paying very close attention to who's dying from it. And so if there are more people exposed than we thought there were, that reduces that fatality percentage with every documented case. And when we see that many celebrities who are, you're recognizing a bunch of names that are testing positive, that's telling us that it's really much more ubiquitous than we thought it was. So rather than cause for increased public alarm, I find myself very encouraged by all of that. So with things like that, with things like personal experience, and then also as you just run people's personalities through the ringer of a difficult period of time like this, they are going to reach the threshold of their abilities to sort of self-regulate the extremes of their personalities. And so they're gonna be like, oh my God, I've been cooped up long enough. It's time to, go enjoy ourselves, and there's no harm, and we'll just, be careful, but it'll be fine. And that's going to creep the whole thing back to an equilibrium that looks much more like normal life and a greatly lessened tolerance for the very docile, obedient behavior you're seeing across the population right now, because it's very afraid and it doesn't know and it hasn't run the parameters. So, this is it's all very interesting. I totally agree that it is absolutely the right thing to do to overreact, if in fact this is an overreaction. We don't know. But we certainly want to err on the side of extreme caution. And it's not as if these, social distancing and self-quarantining procedures are really that arduous. It's not really doing that much damage to anybody's overall existence, at least in the relatively short term. So I completely, we're on the same page where I think, this is going to look much more like normal life in a couple of months.
Mm-hmm. And I think Tom Hanks and his wife Rita Wilson, they were released from the hospital maybe a couple of days ago, saying that they're feeling better. So
this is what it seems to be like. We don't have any major celebrity deaths coming out of this. It's people who feel a little bad after some big international trip, and they happen to take a test, and lo and behold, they're positive, and they hole up in a hotel for a week or two, and it's all fine. So the more stories we hear like that, the more we observe that in our own lives and on the news. it's going to people are not going to remain at the sort of barrel of a gun of an altered CB. We're going to see the resurgence of the baseline of personality, which is that, at any given time, you can expect about half the population to be roughly sort of compliant with this kind of situation, and half of them not to be, and half of them to be really, gonna do what they want, and they're not gonna hide from anybody, and they're just gonna look out for number one, and that's what it's gonna look like. And that half of the bell curve right now, those people who are lower in conscientiousness and who are extremely extroverted, and there's no way they're gonna stay home, and in some capacity just really distorted in terms of their personality, that half is being artificially suppressed by the power of the state, essentially, and the overall fear that is running the show. And so that's a fragile condition to put on those forces of personality, and they are going to reassert themselves as the full half of the bell curve that they are as we move forward in this process.
It's such a delicate way of putting it. I love it.
Yeah. Hey, Nathan, you probably got a computer in front of you or something. Could you look up the cost of a ventilator?
Cost of a ventilator.
Yeah, I'm really curious.
It's probably a lot higher now, but
I'm curious about what typically, are they $50,000 or $10,000?
Yeah, cost between $25,000 and $50,000.
Okay, now just FYI, the
daily cost, by the way, is $4,000.
The daily cost. Oh yeah, that's an insurance scam. That's whatever.
Okay, so one machine is $25,000 to $50,000.
Right. We're going to talk about the real situation. Okay, so the real situation is the worst. Literally at this moment, the worst possible case scenario in the United States would be if the 1% that we see in Korea now holds. And that would result in about 3 million American deaths over the next year. So if that were true, and if it took, and we're going to assume that the virus is not seasonal, that it even with our best efforts, it eventually works its way through the entire population, and we're going to assume that nobody's sort of naturally immune, and that unlike almost anything else, that literally it is able to get to and nail 100% of the population in a year. If that were true, and we had 3 million deaths, I guess people in probably the most acute phases where they're fighting for their lives might be as much as, I don't know, a month on a ventilator. Probably not. Probably a couple of weeks. Okay, so that would be 3 million people, 250,000 of them a month would actually be passing away. And of those, let's suppose we had another, we had a factor of 5 that we had triaged that were in trouble, and that we were trying to save somebody as a result of that. So you could see the possibility that you could have, call it 1 million people at any time on a ventilator. Now, so you need 1 million ventilators, and right now we've got about 125,000. So if you needed an additional 1 million ventilators, and they cost about $35,000, that's $35 billion. And let me tell you something, that's a drop in the bucket. So I'm really not very impressed but what you're hearing bouncing around is scarcity panic.
Yeah, look at the shelves at the grocery store. It's a bank run in the Depression. I mean, this is absolutely scarcity panic feeding upon more scarcity panic.
Yeah. The scarcity panic, I think, includes people in the medical profession. It's like they're thinking, oh my God, we're not going to have enough ventilators. And my thinking is, how hard is it to build 1 million ventilators? It's just can't be that hard. You're manufacturing cars, for God's sakes. If they can make 645,000 Mustangs in a year, how come they can't make 1 million ventilators? And you've got the entire country and the entire United States government behind a process of getting to a manufacturing problem that can't possibly be any more difficult than building a Camry.
Oh, it's not even that difficult. There's the story out of Italy with the hospital that ran out of the valves, and local entrepreneurs with a 3D printer were able to print up hundreds of the valves for a couple of bucks each on their 3D printer. So you open it to market processes, God forbid, and you solve this problem pretty quickly at a fraction of the cost that's being predicted. So the capacity fears and the scarcity panic and all of that, it sells, it bleeds, it leads, and it lends itself to great status on social media to represent this kind of fear mongering and this kind of there's always, we've talked about this before with issues like climate change and others, where the advantage evolutionarily is always to be the advanced messenger. There's always utility in being the one who has the warning before anyone else, and is leading the charge and saying that things are going to be very bad. There's much more advantage socially and status-wise associated with that than there is with saying, oh, everybody just calm down, it's going to be fine. I mean, how many parables exist throughout human history across cultures to sort of reflect this truism? So we're working against a major force in human nature that wants to be the keeper of the advanced wisdom and the advanced warning, and it's being amplified on social media in a very major way. When really these are not intractable problems, they can be solved pretty easily and pretty rapidly with local action and market processes, and certainly with the big stimulus spending that we're seeing coming from the top right now too.
Yeah. So, those of you that are worried that you or your grandmother might be gasping for breath and that there's no ventilator and that's why, we all have to jump in right now, it's not true. You're not going to have a ventilator shortage. There's no way. Remember, the only people that are going to be in serious trouble in this are going to be the elderly and the sick, and the old and sick and the very old. And so all of the able-bodied human beings that are capable of running a factory that can do their little part of the widget to make sure that we get a ventilator built, those people aren't going to have any trouble at all. So the capabilities, this country in World War II, back in the ancient days before I was born, before they had computers, for God's sakes, this country built a warship a day. That's what happened. So when you're in trouble, when you're talking about a real war, for God's sakes, we're not going to get a little problem of 1 million ventilators standing between us and victory. Not a chance in hell. So anyway, that was a reasonable thought for somebody up there in charge thinking this thing through and saying, wait a minute, if we get hit really hard, really fast, we could actually be in trouble. Okay, we could have a bottleneck. And they could have. And so I'm glad that they're doing, they essentially did what they did. It's completely reasonable while we get a much better estimate of the parameters and find out, I'm just taking wild guesses here that somebody would need to be on a ventilator for a month. It's probably not true. It's probably 2 weeks. So it's probably 500,000 ventilators.
Yeah, so, 2 weeks is a pretty common number that I've seen bandied about. Yeah.
And the triaging, hopefully would be good enough that if you ventilate 5, you saved everybody that could be saved, if you had 1 death. Now, maybe it's 10. So I heard originally that it was 10, but it's probably not. It's probably, there's probably much better ability to triage that problem. So, what do I know? But the point is that I know one thing, that I wouldn't let a little problem of bending some metal at a factory floor with machine tools and the industrial capacity of the world triangulated on the problem, that we're going to have a little problem of making basically 1 million cars, for crying out loud. That can't even remotely be a problem. So that's strictly a matter of small ball money. That is not big money relative to the financial issues that are involved in this problem. So that scarcity is a false alarm at this point. And so now we'll go from here while we stare at the problem of what are the real numbers, and hopefully they are somewhat better than we're seeing. I don't know if I said this or not, but because of the because America smokes considerably less than Korea or China, the Korean data that looks like 1% would be mitigated by my estimates by probably 20%. In other words, it would take us from 1% down to 0.8, just as a result of a lower degree of smoking in the culture. So,
and even lower for non-smokers, because that's the
overall
overall number.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. In other words, the degree for non-smokers then would take you down to 0.4. So this is not the threat is considerably less, I think, than obviously the reasonable, quote, worst fears of the people that are in charge, because the people in charge are, reasonably terrified of the worst case scenario. And the last thing you want to do facing something like this is undershoot it. But now I'm trying, because I'm not in charge having to make the calls, I'm able to sit back and actually look at the numerical evidence and look at what I think is probably going to happen. And what I think is probably going to happen is bad. I think you're looking at essentially maybe a really bad flu season that may take out 250,000 elderly people, whereas normally it might be 30 or 40,000. And so that's going to be a significant bump in. I think the annual death rate of the United States is 2.8 million. It may bump up to 3 million this year, and so that's the kind of a magnitude we're looking at, rather than the terrifying worst case scenario of 3 million elderly people. So I think it's
even that worst case scenario is not accounting for the fact that we're moving into springtime and summer, and that there may be a profound mitigating effect with warmth and sunlight on the thing, and that it's not flu season, so-called flu season. And we don't, again, have data on that yet. We don't know how responsive it is, but there's a lot of good reasons to infer that that's going to bring down that number even more. And by the time that we would be going into flu season with the return of cold and darkness, we were closer to having a vaccine at that point if we don't have one already. So, yeah.
Right. And certainly not being in a resource management panic. So we will have the entire country will understand the parameters that they're dealing with much better, and everybody will be prepared. So, yeah, I'm hoping, that's one of the big question marks that keeps the leaders of this problem up at night, is that they don't know we're going to get that seasonal break. So if we do, it's huge.
Most flu-like viruses do respond and are mitigated profoundly by it, but we don't know because we haven't gotten there yet. So parameters.
Parameters. I'm telling you, there's nothing better than analyzing a parameter.
We're easily amused here at the Beat Your Genes podcast, clearly. Yeah. Doesn't take much. We're very happy sheltering in place and just adjusting parameters.
Yes.
Well, one thing our listeners may appreciate is Dr. Hawk wrote an article a couple of days ago called "Of Personalities and Pandemics." And I really liked this article. It was great. Dr. Hawk went over the different personality traits in the Big Five, and how you anticipate each of them would react to this news, and how they would be posting on Facebook. So that is pretty funny.
It's how they would and how they are. It's these are sort of ready-made scripts that certain personalities are just going to pick up because they're automatically comfortable with them, and because they're inferring that narrative and that use of their time and energy is the most optimal for their genetic survival, because that's the kind of personality that they have. So I've talked to a lot of clients. I have good friends and members of my family who are extremely conscientious and very introverted, and they are just vexed as hell by these people who are flouting the rules and out there socializing and not doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is that they're supposed to be following the rules and staying inside and not endangering others. And as sympathetic as I am to them as a fairly conscientious and introverted person myself, it's like you can't this is a central point on the podcast. Like, you cannot expect other people to interpret reality in the same way that you were interpreting reality, because they are filtering it through their personality bias. And nothing reveals extreme personality distortion like a crisis. And the way that people are coping with it in this kind of moment is going to be a real challenge for people interpersonally and socially, as they come up against people with radically different cost-benefit analyses on the common problem for which they have very different solutions, which are emerging from those personality distortions. So this is just a big magnifying glass on all the ways in which we try to solve problems differently, because we perceive that the way that we want to solve the problem is the way that is most optimal for our genetic survival, when somebody that we may be cohabitating with or forced to shelter in place with does not see the world that way. And it's already on day 2 leading to a lot of conflicts and a lot of trouble, and people really failing to understand each other and imagining that there's some big conspiracy and that other people are out to get them, and all these different things, when really it's just personalities being personalities.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Lisle, Dr. Hawk, do you think there's going to be a little baby boom in the next 9 months or so?
Yeah, I've seen a couple of cute names and memes associated with that. Well, I don't know. People are going to entertain themselves if they're stuck inside. That's a pretty predictable way that people entertain themselves. So there could be, for sure.
Yeah, but the low conscientious people aren't inside. So.
That's exactly true. So that it'll cancel it out, actually. Yeah, you've got a lot of high conscientious people that are indoors, but they're going to be very responsible about it.
Yes. Go ahead, Nathan.
And Dr. Lisle, do you think that potentially, I just let me rephrase here. So I have caught up with some friends over the phone or over video chat over the last week or so, and a recurring joke is that now we're actually going to have to face the spouse or the live-in girlfriend or boyfriend. Mm-hmm. And so do you predict that there may be any reevaluations as far as life priorities, work, whatever it is, as people now, they don't have as many pressures of, having to go every minute. They can't stop and think about what they really want. Or do you think people are just going to become more addicted to social media and everything else?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not quite sure what you're saying, Nathan. Try it again. Try it one more time.
I think what I hear him saying is that he's, as people are forced to cohabitate, are they going to reevaluate their relationships? Which, of course they are. They've been in a situation where, the environmental equilibrium that they were in, had a certain level of face-to-face interaction. And if that environmental equilibrium changes, your assessment of somebody that you're cohabitating with could absolutely change, and not for the better. But it could change also for the better. You might realize I've been undervaluing this person. They're very useful in a crisis. So that could happen as well. So, but will people seek sort of escape mechanisms like more social media or other ways to avoid people that they don't want to spend time with? Yeah, of course they will, if those things are available to them. And it is going to generate interpersonal conflict that has always been there, simmering under the surface, but kept in check by environmental constraints like schedules and separate lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. All right. What else we got?
All right.
Any other thoughts?
That answers my question, Dr. Hawk. Thank you. Dr. Lisle, I was mostly, I was thinking exactly what Dr. Hawk said, in the sense that, I guess, I maybe my underlying assumption is that people who may not be optimally happy with each other are that's being masked by the fact that they are competing together oftentimes, but maybe not really that into each other. So now that they're quarantined,
right? In other words, they've got a lot of distractions that and their life goes from an overlap of 16% to 36%. And that, that's going to undoubtedly destabilize the commitment of a lot of people. But I think this is all. My guess is most of the drama is over in 90 days, and I think the world will essentially absorb these parameters. They'll get a real feel for it, and hopefully life is back to normal with not too much of a disaster, by July. So I'm actually, like with Jen, and I'm sure everybody else is hoping that we get a big seasonal break. That would be huge, and it would be very nice if the geniuses of biochemistry could figure out a vaccine that could actually, cut this thing in half. If they could pull off something like that, before essentially 330 million Americans and billions of other people are exposed, then you have a situation where the net total cost of this disaster behind such an innovation could be actually pretty darn substantial. So there's worldwide acclaim, a Nobel Prize, and incredible celebrity and legitimate esteem and self-esteem out there in the waiting for any and all people that are working feverishly on that problem. And so,
hopefully
hey,
not too feverishly.
Fair enough.
We don't want anyone to die for their work.
That's right. You got it. So anyway, that's I think that life a year from now is going to look an awful lot like it does now. I mean, like it did before this ever happened. So let's hope and expect that such a thing will probably be the case.